Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today, we're doing a book club episode. We're actually doing two books today, a little 2-for-1 for you guys. Both books are written by Ronnie Kurtz, and he's going to be our guest today. The first book is published by Christian Focus, and it is No Shadow of Turning. And the other book is published by B&H Publishing, Fruitful Theology. So we're going to cover both these books and a good conversation with Ronnie here in a moment. But as a reminder for you guys, if you go to our show notes, you can click both links and find out both these books. So B&H and Christian Focus, find out these two books, get them for yourselves or somebody you know. And then there's also a link to find the closest confessional Reformed churches near your area. So you hit that link, type in your zip code, find out the closest denominations that come up near you. And also, just showing some love to our sponsors out there, Logos Bible Software, our main sponsor. We call them bridge builders on our show, a little fun play on words. You're going to hear some words from some of our other sponsors halfway through this episode as well. And you as an individual can also be a bridge builder as well. So if you click that Patreon link and you can see the different levels of giving, it just helps us out with the growing podcast and doing some good things. That we're just hit our 2-year anniversary of our show, so we're growing and we want to keep this show moving forward for the whole world. Also, you'll find out just some basic stuff for how to communicate with Peter or myself or both of us. Twitter and Instagram is our social media platforms we're active on. So it's at guiltgracepod on both those platforms. And then our email is guiltgracepod@gmail.com. And these conversations are automatically recorded videos to put on YouTube. So just click that subscribe button on YouTube and check out all the videos that we have categorized by book clubs and our seasons as well. So let Peter further introduce Ronnie Kurtz today.
Yeah, we have Dr. Ronnie Kurtz. He is an assistant professor of theology at Cedarville University. He's a product of that Matthew Barrett powerhouse at Midwestern Baptist. So we'll hear a little bit more about this as well. Before moving to Ohio, Ronnie was a pastor in Kansas City, Missouri for 7 years, where he also taught theology at Midwestern Seminary and Spurgeon College. He's the author of this book, No Shadow of Turning, which is in the Reds series. So we've had one of my professors, Dr. Estelle. There's a few other books there, so if you guys want to pick those up as well. Divine Immutability and the Economy of Redemption. But it's a pleasure having you on, Dr. Kurtz.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate you and appreciate what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you much. And this is not one of the few times. You guys both have your hair done, and my hair is all crazy. And I just noticed that right now. This is a little embarrassing. So sometimes my wife sees the photos of these, it's like you have to do your hair, and this is one of those times like maybe I should do my hair before we start these episodes.
I think you look great, my friend.
It's not that hard. It took me like 5 seconds.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I noticed you were taking. I'm assuming it's a shot of espresso, like right in the middle of a Nick's little introduction. I at first thought that was a regular coffee cup. I was like, oh my gosh, he has humongous hands. I realized it's probably an espresso cup.
Well, it actually is a regular coffee, but it's just a tiny cup. This is pour over. There we go. So I have my carafe.
Okay, so, gotcha. That's right, because you're the coffee guy.
Sadly a touch of a coffee snob. So
that's right. So before we start, maybe I like asking sometimes. We both like asking some icebreakers. What's 2 questions? Best coffee house in your area. And if it's not a coffee house, the best coffee that you've bought online or that you've heard of outside of that.
That's a good one. Yeah. Sadly, you ask a question on a topic that I could talk about for hours.
No.
So coffee is one of the things I care about far too much. So, yeah. But in my area, so I'm in the Dayton, Ohio area here in Cedarville. And I think that the 2 best shops in the Dayton, Ohio area are Press Coffee and Pettibone Coffee. So both of those are outstanding. My favorite coffee shop in the world, though, is in my hometown in St. Louis, Missouri, and it's called Sump Coffee. So there you go. 3 recommendations for you coffee lovers out there.
There you go. We do have listeners in Ohio, so if you guys You guys want to go check out those places, and we accept commissions from coffee houses by sending them over.
Have you heard of Reformation Coffee?
I have, yes, I have heard of it.
Yes, remind me we should give them a shout out. We have not talked about them in a while, and they sent us some coffee.
We did a big giveaway with them a little while ago, but yeah, we got.
Oh, that's awesome.
They've got good coffee. Yeah, they got good coffee,
and they have pictures of Martin Luther on the bag. It's perfect.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. Cool, man. Well, yeah, maybe if our listeners don't know who you are, kind of don't know where you came from, maybe let them know a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. Again, my name is Ronnie Kurtz, teach at Cedarville University. I've been here since January of 22. Yep. And so we're still kind of learning Ohio. We just signed to build a house. So we're putting some roots down, became members of a good local church here in Ohio, and been here about 9-10 months now. And I have loving it so far, loving the institution. I spent the last 9 years in Kansas City, Missouri at Midwestern Seminary and Spurgeon College, taught there, pastored in KC, was a student there, did 2 master's degrees and a PhD there. I had Matthew Barrett as my first reader and J.V. Fesco as my second reader.
Yep.
Love both of those brothers a lot. And they influenced me quite a bit in the process. For fun, like you mentioned, I love coffee, and then the other love of mine is literature. So I read a lot of fiction, a lot of poetry.
Hey, yeah, me too. I love fiction. But what's your favorite fiction book? I mean, that's could be
all time. It's probably Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky.
Yep.
That's probably my favorite. My favorite modern fiction book is probably All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr.
Okay.
Loved both of those. So
did you get on that? I read all things sad or untrue. I forget that.
I have not.
I have it right in front of me. Everything sad is untrue.
Yeah, I don't think that's a fiction book, if I'm not mistaken.
No, it's not a fiction book. No, it's like a kind of a novella of sorts.
Yeah. So so coffee and literature is kind of what I like to do for fun. And baseball. I love St. Louis Cardinal baseball.
That's right. I was about to say, you're in the the Kansas City, St. Louis, following like the Pujols journey of 700 home runs.
That's right. Yes, that's right. Yeah, as a St. Louis boy, I'm a diehard Cardinals fan, and watching that journey to 700 pretty closely. So, I have a wife, Kristen, and we have a 2-year-old daughter, Finley, and man, we're just we love God's people. We love the academy, and I have kind of lived a hybrid life in both. Have 1 foot in the local church, 1 foot in the academy, and kind of where I live my publishing life. This episode is kind of a little bit of a snapshot of where I want to live long term. One of the books we're going to cover is a trade level book written for God's people in the pews. And one book is an academic level book, written for fellow scholars. And that hybrid life is kind of where I want to, that's where I feel comfortable. I love both the academy and the local church. And as long as God allows me, I'm not going to choose one. I'm going to try to live in both worlds as long as I can.
I love it. Yeah.
That's the balance we try to do on this show. So you're a perfect fit to have on our show.
Yeah, that's true. And I know your 2 mentors, Fesco and Barrett, I think they walked that line really, really well. You've had them really well. Since we're covering these 2 books, both Fruitful Theology and No Shadow of Turning, what led to writing both Fruitful Theology and No Shadow of Turning?
Yeah, I'll start with Fruitful Theology. So Fruitful Theology, how the life of the mind leads to the life of the soul. It came about really in that kind of hybrid life of loving doctrine, but also loving real people with real names and real stories, and wanting to recapture the theological life, the contemplative life, as a life of joy and a life of beauty. And to be totally frank, a little bit of it came out of just kind of being disheartened by what takes place online and in local churches that's considered, quote unquote, theological discourse. And in our day and age, the last couple of years, really from, the last 5-6 years, it just felt like there has been so much division.
Yeah.
And even in churches that have been able to kind of assume a standard of unity, have had a harder time having legitimate Christian unity. And that has just saddened my heart. And so from online discourse to local church discourse, I just see a lot of people using theology for poor ends, things like, division, and things like building a platform, things like belittling other people. And to be totally frank, was just, kind of tired of it. And so I know a single book is not going to change the temperature of the conversation, but honestly, what I set out to do was simply encourage those who just refuse to take part in that kind of discourse.
And maybe they might feel alone. It was extremely convicting for me. Reading through the book was rough in a good way.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. So I really just wanted to encourage the person out there who might feel alone when they decide, meekness is the way or kindness is the way. Just say, hey, you're not alone. I think you have the scripture on your side. And so basically all I did, it's not really a brilliant idea, to be totally frank. I worked through Galatians 5 and showed how it's kind of an inverse of a theological virtues book. Typically theological virtue books read like, hey, when you do theology, have these virtues in mind. And I actually kind of flipped the process on its head and said, actually, theology done well can lead to these kind of virtues. And so how does theology lead to love? How does theology lead to patience? How does theology lead to self-control, gentleness, etc.? And kind of the diagnostic question of the book there is in Galatians 5, Paul lists the fruit of the Spirit, but what he's doing in that chapter is he's contrasting the life of the Spirit versus the works of the flesh. And not only does he list the fruit of the Spirit, he also lists the works of the flesh. And what I realized was actually those vices in the works of the flesh might be more of an accurate description of theology today than the fruit of the Spirit. Things like envy, selfish ambition, outbursts of anger, dissension, etc., etc. That might be a more accurate of what's taking place online in the name of theology than things like gentleness and self-control. And so that was kind of the impetus to write that one. For No Shadow of Turning is a bit different. No Shadow of Turning, I wrote my dissertation on immutability. And spent, 4 or 5 years really pressing into the doctrine of divine immutability and really saw the doctrine as beautiful. When I was writing my dissertation, I was writing from 2017 to, mid 2021. And in those years, I saw so much change. Just a couple of them. My wife and I had our first baby after 7 years of 7 years of infertility. My mother passed away from cardiac arrest. The pandemic happened with COVID. There was deep racial disunity, deep political disunity, and it just felt like the world was constantly changing. And it was a pretty serious comfort to my soul to spend 4 years contemplating God's changelessness in an environment that seems to be constantly changing. And so No Shadow of Turning is more of an academic book. Fruitful Theology is more lay level, trade level book. No Shadow of Turning is a version of my dissertation turned towards the publisher. But I'm really just asking for that book. I'm asking, why does it matter that God doesn't change? Particularly, why does it matter for Christian salvation?
And that's also, to also encourage those who are listening, those who are more academically minded, I would still strongly encourage the Fruitful Theology to read that, to learn how can I do theology fruitfully, meekly, humbly for God's glory. And also those who are lay level, look at No Shadow of Turning. It's like, I want to learn about God's changelessness. It's going to be a harder read, but I think it's also going to be, to steal the title of your other book, it's going to be a fruitful read for those who may not be as academically minded. So I still very much encourage crossover between both of those two books, even if you feel like you're in one quote unquote camp or the other.
That's good. I appreciate that.
I definitely share your thoughts on how heartbreaking and frustrating and exhausting it is to see our family of Christians fighting on Twitter about, certain things and stuff. And I get it. Like, we hold true to doctrines and things like that, but there is a time and a place and a way.
It's the way, it's the way we fight. It's not like that we have differences. It's the way we fight that can
exactly. And no one's trying to say to change your closed-handed things about doctrines that we believe in, but it's the way we're conducting ourselves is really thank you for bringing this book out, because a lot of people could use it right now, and so it's good for the Christian community. And so, speaking of that book, the Fruitful Theology, you build, and you mentioned this. We're talking a little bit about Galatians 5. You build on the fruit of the Spirit passage from Galatians 5. What does the fruit of the Spirit have to do with theology and doing theology? Just to kind of dig into that more.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I want to do in the beginning of Fruitful Theology, it's no surprise to anyone who actually knows me, but one of my deepest influences in the theological life is a theologian named John Webster.
Mm-hmm.
And
one of the hardest theologians I've ever read. He's
his work
good.
Yeah, his work stirs my affection, and he writes with the clarity that I would love the Lord to grant me even half of. But Webster, drawing on a long line of theologians throughout church history, defines theology as the study of God and all things in relation to God. And I'm convinced by that definition of Christian theology as the right definition, the study of God and all things in relation to God. And therefore, I really do believe that theology is a spiritual exercise. We are trying to turn our mind's eye Godward. And my hope, the conviction of the book, the conviction of my heart, is that as we turn our mind's eye Godward and we focus on him, as 2 Corinthians says, as we behold him, that we actually don't just look at him, but looking at him leads to our looking like him. Yep. And so the goal, really the verse that's under Fruitful Theology is 2 Corinthians 3, behold Christ from one degree of glory to another. Yep. That's really what I'm after. And I want to simply help God's people learn how to develop an appetite for the deep things of God, such that as they look at God, their soul is transformed, so that they see that the life of the mind really is connected to the life of the soul. And I think if Galatians 5 lists the fruit of the Spirit and theology is a spiritual exercise, then what we will be marked by are the things of the Spirit, such as love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, self-control, gentleness, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to encourage our listeners, I think also to encourage, because I preached Galatians over the summer. And so obviously Galatians 5 being one of the chapters that you cover in the book Galatians. And I mean, I think sometimes authors can kind of pull verses out of context. Oh, this applies here, but I think you nailed it. Because it's Galatians is all about, I mean, there's justification by faith alone. There's the law gospel distinction that Paul talks about as well. But there's also this relationship that the Judaizers have to the Gentile Christians in the book of Galatians. And Galatians 2 is all about like this table of fellowship that gets kind of overrun by Judaizers who kind of convince Peter, is like, hey, you can't hang out with these people. And then Galatians 5 comes in after Galatians 4 talking about this. And then Galatians 6 is like community. It's like, how do we live this stuff out? How do we bring a brother back in who's faulted in some way, who's transgressed the law in some way? So I appreciate the contextual awareness that you have in this stuff, that I think it bears fruits in your study, because I think you took what the author, what Paul meant in Galatians, which is, I think, helpful, because like I said, sometimes authors, pastors, theologians, whatever, can take like kind of their pet verse and say, oh, this applies here. It's like, well, it really doesn't. But I think you take what needs to be taken out of that verse and out of that little portion. Well,
yeah, I think that's important, because the context there gives you two things that you would miss if you were just pulling out the fruit of the Spirit. Yep. The first is that notion of freedom, Galatians 5, that comes with the life of the Spirit versus the work of the flesh.
He says it again, and then he goes into this verse.
Right. Yeah, the reality is a life of the mind that leads to things like selfish ambition, the ruthless and never-ending desire for the applause of man, that is not freedom.
No.
And a life of
that's
love
what Paul's preaching against in this.
Exactly. That's right. And then that's the first thing, the life of freedom. The second thing is pursuing the fruit of the Spirit is what allows you to bear your brother's burden.
Yep, exactly.
And the outcome, if you compare the fruit of the Spirit versus the work of the flesh, the work of the flesh is that you'll devour one another.
Oh yeah,
the fruit of the Spirit is that you'll bear one another's burden.
Galatians
and
5,
basically what I'm trying to get at is
devouring each other. Yeah.
Yeah. What does our theological life most look like right now?
Yep.
Devouring one another or bearing one another's burdens?
Exactly.
And my worry is that it might be the former.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And so as we transition from fruitful theology, talking about Galatians, turning to no shadow of turning. So people probably heard you say divine immutability, and those who are not maybe as theologically adept are like, well, why would you mute God? Like, what's wrong with what's wrong with this? But what does divine immunity mean, and how does it help us better understand who God is, and like you said, how He doesn't change? What does it mean, and how does that help us understand God?
Yeah. Simply put, there's obviously a lot of caveats that we could do here, but simply put, its most basic form, divine immutability teaches us that God's perfection does not change, and in fact, it cannot change. And so when we affirm a doctrine like divine immutability, we are simply saying that we are denying of God any change. We are denying any change to his person, any change to the Trinity, any change to his perfections, any change to his parts, any change to his passions, any change to his plans, anything like that. We are denying that God changes. We are denying that God changes for the better, such that, he could get any better, and we are denying that God could change for the worse, such that he has potential to decrease in perfection.
Yeah.
And so, in its most basic form, I think it's a twofold denial. The first is we're denying that God does change, and the second is we're denying that it's even possible for him to change.
Yeah, and we'll cover this a little bit more later too. But there's probably like halfway through your book, and you go through some Puritans, some reformers, some medieval scholastics, some reformed scholastics. There's an interesting section too that divine immutability like may encompass a lot of the doctrines that we think about. I mean, if you can talk about not it being like the bedrock, but there's something to immutability that keeps God who he is and always who he is. If you can maybe dive into that a little bit as well, that like he doesn't change, but all that stuff.
My feed cut out just a touch. Could you repeat that last part of your question? So sorry.
No, yeah. So it's you talk about halfway through the book, you go through some of these theologians, and you say divine immutability. It's not like the doctrine, but it does kind of hold these doctrines to show that God doesn't change. So maybe you can tell the relationship. Not saying that like God is not composed of parts. It's not like he has a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But how does immutability like keep our understanding of God changeless versus all these things around kind of changing him?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do go through. I have a section in the book where I devote 3 chapters to kind of a constructive argument for divine immutability. So I go through 3 different lanes. I use a biblical lane, a historical lane, and a theological philosophical lane. And in the historical lane, I do work through a ton of voices. And immutability did enjoy a pretty strong affirmation, there's some pretty strong continuity there
for a long time.
One of the voices that I bring to bear is Stephen Charnock. And Charnock actually calls divine immutability the enamel of all of the other perfections.
Yeah, that's the word I couldn't think of, but I remember he said something about it.
Charnock's, by the way, for anyone who's interested in reading more about immutability, Charnock's section on immutability is probably 40-ish pages long in his Existence and Attributes of God. And it is it's first class. I mean, it is outstanding. Him and Petrus von Maastricht honestly have 2 of the best sections on immutability I've ever read. They both care about the nuances and why it matters and why it's beautiful. And they capture it in really helpful ways. So anyways, Charnock talks about immutability as the enamel of the other perfections. And what he means by that is all of the other perfections of God, whether we talk about cataphatic or apophatic, positive or negative predications to God.
Things you can say about God and then things that we can't say about God.
That's exactly right. Yep. Whether we talk about, God in the positive, that he is something, like he is love, or we talk about him in the negative, like he is
not that he's negative, but like there are things that are not true of him.
That's right. Like he's immutable. He doesn't change. Exactly. That's a negative state.
And he can't sin.
That's right. Sin. Yeah, that's exactly right. Charnock says whether we're talking about the positive or the negative, they lose their beauty if you lose immutability. Because what good is it to us for a God who might have righteousness such that he could lose it one day?
Yeah.
Or what benefit is it to us for a God who might have being all wise, omnisapience, that might lose his wisdom one day?
Yep.
And so immutability is the denial of change in any perfection in God. And so he calls it the enamel because it's what makes sure that these perfections have staying power. And I think he's right to do so.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah, and speaking of that, I mean, just that God can't break his promises, or he wouldn't be God anymore. And that's what's so powerful about covenants too.
Yes.
And for
which we'll talk about pretty soon. Yeah, the covenantal nature and how this adds to his or doesn't add, but shows forth his immutability.
Yeah, it just helps with as Christians, our assurance in him, knowing he cannot lie. He cannot break his promises. So right. It's good stuff. So turning back to fruitful theology for a moment. And this is kind of more of like what's going on in the heart question. So too often we turn to social media because it's right in front of us. I mean, we're not going to lie. It's not in and of itself bad.
It's hard not to. Yeah.
It brings, there's a lot of good stuff that we get out of social media, but the thing is, like, we turn to it and there's or attend various conferences. Theology leads us to not to sometimes based on our sinful nature, love to not love our neighbor and God, but attempting to use theology for maybe person's self-glorification or cutting down others who do not view God precisely the exact same way we do. Is there something about theological learning that makes us ironically arrogant, or how might we better understand engaging theology? Because I mean, if we're theologians, we have to assume we're believers, and so our heart must have been, by the Holy Spirit, our heart must have been changed from stone. So why are we still acting this way?
There's even a joke like the cage stage Calvinist phase, like this is kind of deep in our hearts, that this has happened to me, this has happened to all of us.
Yeah, good question. A few things I would say there. First, in the book, I ask the question, what's wrong with theology?
Exactly.
The answer to that question is nothing. Theology is doing just fine, just as theology has been doing since the opening salvo of mankind. The problem is us. And you are right to say that we are all theologians, right? So I talk about that in the book. The question is not, will you be a theologian? If theology is the study of God and all things in relation to God, anytime you have thoughts about God or anything in relation to him, you are a theologian. So the question is not, will you be a theologian? The question is, will you be a faithful one? And I don't think there's anything wrong with theology. I do think there's a few things wrong with us. And I think that shows itself in when we use theology poorly. Often, theology can become an end. That's the goal we're after. And I think once we start trying to make theology something it was never supposed to be, it can go really bad for us. The goal for us Christians is God. The triune God is who we are after. We want more of him. And theology happens to be a really good tool that he has given us in order to pursue him. But once theology becomes the goal, what happens is we start seeking out of theology things that theology can't give us, like comfort, emotional stability, community, things that theology was never meant to be an end of. It was meant to be an instrument for. So sometimes that can happen. I think the other thing that can happen is when folks forget what theology is about, being about God. Because if theology is about the accumulation of facts, then once you start having more facts than your neighbor, it is easy to pursue selfish ambition and the applause of man. But once theology is about, when we right-size theology and make it about God, the best theologians are the ones who look most like him. The best theologians are the ones who are most conformed into his image. And so I think the best theologians are not the ones who simply have the most facts, but the ones who have a rooted soul, rooted in gentleness and self-control and kindness and love, etc. And when we start pursuing theology in a pursuit of being conformed into the image of God, it won't lead to the kinds of things you're seeing on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, or name your social media. But instead, it will lead to a robust inward life that leads to the ability to bear the burden of our neighbors.
Yeah. Before next question too, because I think, and you talk about this, we've had other people talk about this as well. We don't need more theology. We need to just do more stuff, because if you learn more theology, then your head's going to be kind of stuffed with all this knowledge that it's not going to make you love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Your neighbors yourself. You're not going to love people, because you're going to love puffing yourself up. So it seems like there's also not even an unnecessary, but like can you divorce like theological learning from like what you do? Is that like, we've had other people on like kind of talk about this stuff, where, like you said, there's the academy and there's the church, and there seems to be a divorce between these two things, or what we learn and what we do.
Yeah, well, hopefully I don't step on any toes of previous guests, but I very much dislike that notion of we don't need more theology, we need to do more stuff. I think that is probably welling up from a really poor understanding of what theology is. The reality is your mind and your affections are much closer than you think they are. And that which you contemplate, you will come to appreciate. And if you spend significant time with legitimate focus on contemplating God, it should lead to the stirring of your affections. I think I say in the book something like, a head full of truth should lead to a heart full of love and hands full of care. And that's exactly right. Those things are connected. We should not divorce them. In the Christian life, we do not have the option to dichotomize truth and love. That decision is made for us by the Lord and in his imperatives of the scriptures. We pursue both truth and love. And once we try to pursue one without the other, it can lead to really bad ends, and we just can't do that. I like what you said. We don't pursue theology as an end in itself for the sake of our knowledge. We pursue theology so we know God and the things pertaining to God, which may not be like the only thing you think about. That's not going to be like, oh, this is the make or break it. But I think it's a really helpful corrective for why we do what we do.
Yeah, a means to an end kind of thing. And it is a good reminder that when we are engaging in theology, we're reading our favorite books we get in, because like you said, what's wrong with theology? Absolutely nothing. This is great that we still have theologians out there, faithful theologians writing works, and people should read them, because we need to learn more about our God. And when we're engaging in reading these works, instead of reading them, coming into it saying, hey, I got to find that gotcha moment, that smoking gun, so I can just bury my opponent and just win the argument, because I'm going to look really smart and just get them, versus out of just being so in love with our God and being like, in a good way, obsessed with God, where I can't stop thinking about him. I want to learn more about him. What can I do? Oh, there's this book from Ronnie Kurtz. There's this book from J.V. Fesco. There's this book from Matthew Barrett or Michael Kruger that I want to just like, I'm going to be using them to learn more about God. And out of that organic, genuine growth of fruitfulness, that sanctification, then when you're in front of somebody that might be an opponent and you have to use apologetics, I can see where you're saying it's coming from more of a fruitful heart versus oh, you know what, I got this line item I'm going to get you on.
Yeah, you're bringing up one of the things I really wanted to communicate clearly in the book, that if there's a lot of things I want readers to get out of the book, but this is one of them. When you recalibrate in your own mind theology as a mere war tactic and recalibrate it to theology as a well of joy, it totally changes how you treat theological dialogue. Because exactly what you said is right. It goes from, I've got to, quote unquote, own my opponent, and you have to be this like shock jock commentator who's using theology as like these mic drop moments. That's like war tactics, and it should be beneath Christians. And if you use theology as a mere war tactic, it leads to so much division and so much selfish ambition. Instead, if you think of someone who has wrong theology, not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a brother or sister who is wayward, that needs to be reminded they are leaving joy on the field. Because what's at stake in wrong theology is for sure heaven and hell. And therefore we have to warn people. But also what's at stake is legitimate life of joy.
Yeah.
And so, if someone is incorrect in their theology or they're believing false theology, not only are they on a dangerous path, but they are leaving a lot of joy on the field. And if we can think of our, those who disagree with us theologically, if we could stop thinking of them always as enemies. Now, that's obviously a different story when it's legitimate heresy and there's a wolf in the church. But if we could stop thinking of those who have minor disagreements with us as quote unquote enemies and think of them as people who are leaving joy on the field, that totally changes the tone and the care with which we go about talking to them about theological discourse.
That's good. So yeah, let's switch gears to the No Shadow book. And about halfway through that book, you begin discussing the covenantal, we brought this up earlier, the covenantal nature of Scripture being the bedrock foundation for divine immutability. And, like Michael Horton said, it's the covenants in the Bible is like the
superstructure.
Superstructure, the of the it's like the skeleton, it's the bones of the Bible. So can you discuss this relationship?
Yeah, the relationship between covenant and immutability is pretty important. And the reason it gets brought up in my book is because I'm talking about a robust understanding or robust approach to the doctrine of immutability that goes beyond a kind of mere naive biblicism. The reality is both those who want to argue biblically for immutability and those who want to argue biblically for mutability, that God changes, both have kind of an easy task, because there are passages which seem to indicate immutability, right? God doesn't change. He's not a man. James 1:17, which is where the title of the book comes from.
Yep.
And there are passages like in Samuel where it seems like God changes. He repents.
Samuel 15. Yep.
Yeah, that's right. He relents of what he was going to do. He seems to change his mind sometimes.
Yeah, it's in the book of Amos too. He talks about repenting. Yep. That's
right. And so if we are talking about a mere biblicism, which simply just pulls gotcha verses out and says, look, God doesn't change, or look, God does change.
Yeah.
The reality is the task is equally easy. So we need something more mature than simply pulling gotcha verses. And I argue for a threefold approach to arguing a biblical case for immutability.
Not biblicist, biblical.
That's right. That's exactly right. And one of those is paying attention to the covenantal nature of God's action. From beginning to end of the Bible, God is relentlessly faithful to his people. To absolutely absurd degrees.
Yeah, we would never imagine being this faithful ourselves.
That's right. Yeah, God is unbelievably faithful to his people. And I think that is one area, I call it demonstrating God's immutability. There are some passages which declare God's immutability, like those ones we mentioned. Micah 3, James 1:17, they declare it. God doesn't change. There are some passages that demand it, like when it says God is eternal or when it says God is holy, they demand immutability. And there are some passages which display it. And I think the covenant nature of the Scripture is a display of God's immutability. He doesn't change in his faithfulness to his people.
Yeah, that's a huge point, because it's to be to be quite frank, I had never thought about it that way until reading through that portion of your book on the covenantal nature of Scripture and God's covenantal working with man. Because I preached through Judges last summer. It is painfully obvious that people don't want to be associated with God, and God's like, no, I covenanted with you. I'm going after you. I promised you at the foot of Sinai, and I'm gonna keep. And I promised you with Abraham, I'm gonna keep coming after you. I had never thought about it that way. So I encourage those who we have. A lot of people who are who see the covenantal nature of the Bible, who listen to us. We've had a full season on the covenantal nature of the Bible, but I think it was I wouldn't say it was like a corrective for me. I had never seen the lens until you pointed out. It was really, really, really helpful seeing.
Good.
God's, and it's also preaching through Amos. I'm right in the middle of it right now. It is astonishing just how far Israel and Judah had fallen. They look like the nations, not taking care of who they should take care of. And God still says, even though he still judges them, he still says, I am with you. I am your God. You're my people. Mm-hmm. Which, like you said, it now makes sense. Okay, now you can put these like categories on these things.
The reality is who God is impacts what God does.
Exactly.
And the person of God, the ontology of God, his very being is unchanging.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense that his action towards his people is unchanging. And that's where immutability becomes good news.
Yeah. So we won't go through some of the history of this stuff, and people can read through some of the history on this. But going back to Fruitful Theology, people might be like going through whiplash, like we're going through one book and then the other book. But going back to
this is the first time I've ever talked about both books at the same time. So this is
right.
An interesting. Yeah. Typically, I have like a lay level conversation and an academic one. So this is fun to kind of traverse both of these with you guys.
Yeah, this is the first one and the only one I'll ever have on the two books. After this, it'll just be one book from here on out. But so Fruitful Theology, and like I said, to be honest, and this is not me saying it was bad, but like it is a good, painful process reading through this. Painful because I think it's easy to see. Like I didn't read this and like think of anybody else besides myself. It's like I didn't think like, oh, this person has to read this, because I think if we're thinking that, like we're still kind of following this trap.
That's right.
See how we've become theologically arrogant, and my wife can tell you stories about my theological arrogance versus displaying the fruits of the Spirit as a result of our theological growth. And so what are you hoping, and people aren't going to change instantly, but what are you hoping this helps them see theology as, and how to pursue theological learning?
Yeah, well, I let me start by saying I resonate with even the pain that you were talking about with reading it. I felt the exact same thing in writing it, and even in the acknowledgments of the book. I even kind of mentioned this, that writing a book on the fruit of the Spirit is difficult because within every chapter, there was kind of a feedback loop in my inner dialogue of like, hey, you're not really this kind of person.
I know, yeah.
And for you to be writing a book on encouraging people to be this kind of person is quite hypocritical of you. I had that the whole time I was writing. And so in my acknowledgments, I start, while this might sound like, cheesy Christianity or whatever, I start by acknowledging the triune God, because the reality is that inward loop, well, it probably was unhealthy at some points. It's not wrong.
Yeah.
There really are many times where I haven't been a loving person. I haven't been a kind person. I haven't been a self-controlled person. And so I first acknowledged the triune God who saw my helpless estate and came after me. And for every time I was unfaithful in displaying the fruit of the Spirit, he is infinitely faithful. And so I do think that conviction you were feeling, I hope folks feel that. Yeah. And I hope it doesn't lead to self-despair.
Yeah, just like navel gazing.
That's right. I hope it doesn't lead to that, but I do hope it leads to the recognition, maybe reread the Gospels with that in mind and see the absolute perfection that Jesus displays in his life on earth in showcasing the fruit of the Spirit. And remember that in the gospel, the crazy reality is you've been united to him.
Yep.
And for all of his faithfulness, it's now been accredited to your account. And that's remarkable. So to answer your question, what am I hoping for? I'm really not trying to I know Fruitful Theology is not going to make Twitter a better place. It's not going to make the divisions in your church go away. It's just not going to do that.
Yeah.
I don't know that any book's going to, honestly. If the New Testament's not doing it, Fruitful Theology
on this side of new creation, we're not going to experience. Yeah,
that's right.
Yes.
So I think the thing I'm most after, like I said earlier in the show, is there are times in which I'll hop on social media or I'll be a part of a local body that's disagreeing with another and think like, is anyone pursuing kindness? Like, why is everyone trying to be the loudest in the room or the most shocking in the room? And there were times where I just felt alone and looking, politically looking left and right, culturally looking left and right, theologically looking left and right, and just being like, where is the level-headed reasonableness right now? And it just felt like I was alone in the desire for that. Not that I always am those things, but at least just desiring it. And so honestly, the thing I wanted out of the book was just for that person to be like, no, I'm not alone. There are others who see the slow prod towards developing myself into the kind of person that can be rightly categorized by the fruit of the Spirit. That's worth it. It's worth it to keep going. Keep putting your head down. Keep going on that slow prod towards Christian faithfulness in which we are being slowly but surely, by the grace of God, being transformed into his image. That's really, it's a small hope, but that was kind of the hope of the book.
Yeah, I like it.
If I had to guess, and I'm saying this generally, when people tend to think that they want to disagree with, and especially if they're it's another Christian, they think that they don't want to agree with them, so they don't want to come off that they're coming across meek or soft. If they feel like they have to disagree with them on something, they have to do it in a loud, aggressive way, because if you don't do it in a loud, aggressive way, it comes across that you're agreeing with them. I feel like that's a confusion people have maybe in their own mind or something. If I don't come across verbally violent, then it looks like I'm agreeing with you, when it should be like, we're not saying that we have to agree on everything, but we should agree on the close-handed biblical gospel things for truths, for sure. But I mean, I think that even if you're in the playfield of disagreement, is what you're saying, is still coming across in a loving way.
Yeah, that's right. We are suffering from a bad correspondence in that we often correspond accuracy with volume. Whoever is the loudest in the room is probably the most right, or whoever is the most self-assured is the most right. And I'm just not convinced of that. And
or if you're not loud, that you agree with me.
That's exactly right. And so I want to maybe recalibrate the Christian mind towards stability instead of volume, and say, let's look at those voices that are more stable than that are loud. I think that's a much more Christian identifier, stability and wisdom, than volume.
Yeah. So last question, last little whiplash for our listeners. But we've talked about the doctrine of God a little bit. We haven't said the word specifically, but the classical tradition, and it's come under question. I wouldn't say attack, but it's come under question as of late. It's not like we're not new in history that this has come under question. This has always kind of been the case. But what do you hope in your book, No Shadow of Turning, will contribute to this conversation and the doctrine of divine immutability for the conversation going forward? Not necessarily to be like you said, like not like a getcha and like I'm gonna win this over you, but to improve the conversation.
I'm very aware of the conversation surrounding, classical theism, or whatever phrase you want to use, and the disagreements surrounding particular doctrines within, what's called classical theism. Very aware of that. I don't really see myself in the field of polemics. That's just not where I feel comfortable. So it's not like there are other theologians doing much more impressive work than I'm doing when it comes to
you're
polemics.
Constructing. You're not going after.
That's right. Yeah, I much would rather construct than tear down. It's just that's my personality. It's how I'm wired. And honestly, beyond that, it's just what I know my own strengths, and I'm just not a good polemicist. And so what I'm after is there are other people having the conversation. Are classical doctrines true? And that's a really good conversation. It's just not the conversation I'm having. And the conversation I want to have with my work in classical theology is I'm going to work from the assumption that they're true. Happy to talk about it, otherwise. But instead, I'm after, are they beautiful? And what can classical theology do to root us in those transcendental realities like truth, beauty, and goodness? And so the kind of question I'm asking is not, is immutability true? The kind of question I'm asking is, what does immutability have to do with salvation? And how can that lead the Christian to worship? That's a very different conversation than, is immutability true? Again, I'm happy to talk about that. I've done a lot of thinking about that topic. But most importantly, I want to basically work on, I've told people tongue in cheek before that really my work, even with books that I'm currently working on, past these two, my scholarship is really is a career on thinking about divine action. That's really what it is. I'm really after the question of, how does this God act in these ways? And for the No Shadow of Turning book, the that and the these are, how does an immutable God act in the economy of redemption? And why should that lead to the assurance of believers that he's unchanging and therefore has provided an unchanging redemption? I think immutability is one of many answers that you could give to the question of, when you lay down at night, what gives you assurance that you're going to wake up a Christian tomorrow? There's a lot of answers that would help that question, but I think immutability is one of them.
Yeah.
The immutable God has provided an immutable righteousness and immutably declared you united to his son.
That was one of the few, not few, but one of the many sections I highlighted was that section that you have, that you're talking about right now.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I recall that from the book.
That's kind of what I'm after. And so if you're asking like, what role do I help to play in this whole classical conversation? I don't have illusions of grandeur. I don't think I'm going to change a ton, but I do want to be at least one voice pointing towards the good, the true, and the beautiful, and using ancient doctrines and ancient voices as a way to maybe do that.
Yeah. And speaking of that verse that's really helped me with that is just knowing nothing in all of creation will separate us from the love of God. Romans 8:39.
Yeah,
yep.
And I think that's just really helpful for my insurance. And then the understanding the covenants has been so helpful, knowing that he can't be God if he breaks his promises. And, going back to the Abrahamic covenant and walking through the viscera, and he can, he will cease to be God if he breaks his covenant, and nothing's going to separate us from the love of him in all creation. So that's great. And maybe also speaking of the no shadow book, to wrap up this conversation, you wrap up that book in conclusion talking about Charles Spurgeon's very first sermon. And why was that so appropriate to wrap up the book with, to introduce to the audience?
I think there was part of me that it was a little nod to my own desire to bring the academy in the church together. And so I don't think, had you read No Shadow of Turning from cover to cover, I don't think you would expect the conclusion to start with a quote from the pulpit. Just because, the previous 200 pages or whatever it is, I'm dealing with pretty academic questions and whatnot. And so I wanted to end, there are other theologians out there who do this really well. I remember reading G.K. Beale's book on We Become What We Worship.
Oh yeah.
And he ends it with a prayer. And I thought, that's,
if you know G.K. Beale, yeah, that's the man he is.
I love that. And I remember reading that, and I'm convinced by the content of that book, but more than the content, I was so impressed with the fact that this man will be a Christian while he's a scholar.
Oh yeah.
And I just kind of wanted that as well. And so I thought, a lot of people have read Knowing God, the book by J.I. Packer. It was transformational for me in my undergraduate. And that he starts off with that Spurgeon quote that's so good, that reminds you that, when you turn your mind's eye towards God, you recognize you are but of dust and you know nothing. But most people don't realize that quote came out of Spurgeon's sermon titled The Immutability of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was actually contemplating divine immutability that led Spurgeon to some of these really beautiful conclusions about how tiny we creatures are in comparison to the Creator, and not just tiny, altogether different than the Creator. And so I wanted to end the book and the conclusion with a nod towards local church pastors, local church members, and say, in the end, this was written for you.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the goal there.
That's cool.
Yeah. No, it was like you said, it's a different theological book. Not that it's tremendous. I mean, like I said, we were talking before, it's tremendously well written, which I encourage people just to see good writing, and on top of that, great content. But yeah, there's a heart for, what does immutability do for us in our relationship with God, and what God has done for us, that I think bears itself. And the thing is, you don't say it outright all the time, but you can feel it through the writing, that the desire is for us to know that God will not change, God will not lose you, God will keep you. Right. And if we divorce this doctrine from that, we don't see the beauty of this doctrine. And I think you show forth that beauty really well.
Yeah, that's kind of you to say, man. I appreciate it.
So thank you, Dr. Kurtz. And maybe before we end, where can people find you, find your work, what you're doing, what you're up to?
Yeah. Oh, great question. So I have these two books, Fruitful Theology. I don't know when this is going to air, but at the time of this recording, Fruitful Theology is already out. You can find it, basically wherever books are sold. And then No Shadow of Turning comes out later this year. It'll come out, I think November 15th is the launch day.
Okay, yeah. So this comes out October 27th. So it'll come out just a few weeks before that. Yep.
Okay. So yeah, in a few weeks, No Shadow of Turning will come out. I think Christian Focus is releasing it at ETS. Okay. So anyone who's at ETS should be able to pick up.
Evangelical Theological Society, for those who are not.
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you. Like us.
Yeah, it's the nerd conference for theologians, is what I affectionately refer to it as my wife, to my wife. But other than that, I am working on a few books right now that I'm excited about, of course. One of the doctrines that I care about a lot, the book that I've most wanted to write, is on the doctrine of divine incomprehensibility. And what does it mean for the creature to even try to attempt to know and name the Creator? Yep. And that doctrine has played a really important role in the history of Christian thinking. Yeah. And so I'm working on a book right now that's due at the end of the year to IVP Academic on incomprehensibility. So I'm working on that one. I'm working on a book and with B&H Academic. Matthew Barrett and Craig Carter are working on I think it's a 16 volume right now. Yep. A planned 16 volume series on systematic theology.
Yeah, we'll be doing that whole series with B&H.
What did you say?
We'll be doing that whole series. We'll be interviewing all the authors with B&H.
Oh, wow, cool. That means we'll get to see each other again. Yeah, I'm doing the volume on creation.
Oh, cool.
Trying to ask, there's a ton of really good scientific books on creation. I'm not a scientist. I don't plan to touch the scientific conversations. But what does a truly theological account of creation look like? Which is really, again, tattling on myself, really a book about divine action. How does this God do this thing? And in that book, it's going to be how does the classical articulation of God do creation, the divine action of creation. And then I have another book that's not quite public yet, but it'll be on, hopefully, somewhere between the academic and lay level, on what does it look like to preach the classical doctrine of the Trinity.
Nice.
To preach and teach the classical doctrine of the Trinity. So that one's not quite public yet. Hopefully I'll be able to talk more about that one. It's a co-authored book with a few other folks, and hopefully I'll be able to say more about that one in the coming months.
Awesome. Cool.
We'll see you again then.
Yeah,
that's right.
Looks like we've got a few other dates coming up. But yeah, it's Dr. Kurtz, thank you for writing these two books, for coming on our show, for both providing a constructive account, but also even on top of that, showing us what theology is there for, how we do theology, why we do theology, and what it should do for us in our relationship with God. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate you guys, and thanks again. This was a fun conversation.
Thanks.
Awesome.